Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening. I'm Dimitra Janakoulias, and I'm the state coordinator for Braver Angels Oregon. If you're new to Braver Angels, we're a grassroots organization dedicated to restoring civic health and reducing partisan conflict. We don't seek to change people's minds about the issues, but we do engage people we disagree with and respect our differences. Today, I'm speaking with Zachary Elwood, a technical writer who's been thinking a lot about our political and cultural divides since the 2016 election. He has published two books, Diffusing American Anger and How Contempt Destroys Democracy. Zach also hosts a podcast called People Read People, which aims to better understand human psychology and what drives human behavior. I'll start off by saying that, Zach, I really respect the work that you do. I think your podcast is wonderful, and I think that the insights you share in your books and articles need to be heard by many more people. So thanks so much for being here.
Oh, thanks, Dimitra. Yeah, it's an honor. Thanks for asking me. It means a lot. And just want to say that the podcast name is People Who Read People.
Thanks for that. People who read people. Okay.
Yeah, it's a weird title, admittedly. It was supposed to be a play on words on people who need people.
Anyway, it's a great podcast. So thanks for hosting that. So let's get started. First off, would you share a little bit about your upbringing? What were some key influences in your life and how did they shape your worldviews as an adult?
Yeah, so I grew up in Southern Maryland, which is a rural area, and it was a good mix of politically mixed group of people, which I think a wide range of politics and socioeconomic and these kinds of things. So I think that is a factor because I think I got used to talking to a wide range of people. I think that was a factor, and then also when I went to my first college, I went to a college called Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia, which was a real they considered it like a kind of an Ivy League quality school, just kind of like a little bit out of the most well-known ones, but it was a really hard school and it was a very conservative school, and I came from a very politically liberal family, so I kind of absorbed a lot of animosity about conservative ideas without really understanding. I couldn't argue well about the animosity I'd absorbed from my family and their friends towards conservative principles and ideas. So when I went to this college, there was a big humbling experience of me often getting in these debates, and these people were much smarter than I was, a lot of conservatives, and I hadn't really studied the issues like they had. A lot of these people were like politics, majors and such, so they really knew what they were talking about. So I was often getting in these arguments where I couldn't hold my own, and often being humbled and realizing, oh, I just kind of have this anger and animosity without even really knowing what I'm talking about. I just have kind of a group, related animosity, and that was a humbling experience that taught me that sometimes, the things we think are not don't really have a good foundation under them. Um, but yeah, I'd say those were kind of pivotal moments for this work and my upbringing. Yeah.
Oh, so you were put into the fire as a college student. Yeah, getting your own views challenged in a very different environment from your family environment politically.
Right. It was just the kind of conversations I'd never really had before because I just had absorbed them through, sitting around the house at home and hearing my parents and friends of theirs talk. But yeah, it's much different when you're around people that can win arguments and destroy
Yeah,
you without, so it can be quite humbling from a, yeah,
yes,
ideological perspective and such. Yeah.
right. So you ventured into the world of polarization after the 2016 election. And at that time, you vented a lot of anger on social media about Donald Trump being elected. But then you realized this country's divided and I'm part of this problem. What happened? Was there a defining moment or certain experiences that led you to have a change of mind and heart?
Yeah. And I think I should preface it by saying I would often try to vent my anger and frustrations in ways that were pretty clearly insulting and unhelpful. Like I would say things like voting for Trump, supporting Trump as a clear, it was like a moral test, and you people failed it, and these kinds of things, right? I would be very insulting, and it was kind of purposely, like a lot of people do on both sides. It was a way to just vent my anger, right? But it was phrased in kind of like intellectual, fancy language and such. But so yeah, I was doing that for a while. And I think the things that made me start to think more about conflict dynamics and polarization dynamics and be interested in how these things worked. I was, I just started, well, I saw how I drove people away that I knew personally, for one thing, like on Facebook, we're often speaking in the worst ways on social media because we're distant from each other. So I saw how I alienated people I knew, and they would say mean things back to me, and just kind of accentuating to me, emphasizing to me how there's a toxic back and forth going on. And then it was also getting interested in reading about polarization and starting to get curious about how we got to this point, because I hadn't been that political up until that point. So it got me down the rabbit hole of reading about how conflicts and polarization happen in other countries for completely different issues, completely different kinds of groups, but the underlying dynamics are the same. There's this, if you look at, I'm sure many people watching know, if you look at the amount of partisan animosity over the past, 2, 3 decades, it, keeps going up in America. So it's this increasing cycle, which is a common thing in toxic conflict in general. This kind of self-reinforcing, contempt leads to contempt kind of scenario. So that got me curious about this psychological underpinning of how conflict works, and then reading more about what the gripes were that, on the conservative side, about what they were upset about and how they justified voting for Trump, what their reasonings were. I understood more that this was just, in my mind, in my thinking, and in many other people's thinking, this escalation of contempt for each other, and those things naturally build. That's, you can just find so many examples throughout history and so many countries now, that this is just some fundamental human problem we're dealing with.
Mhm. So it was a combination of your personal experience, what was happening between you and your friends, family, acquaintances, your relationships were changing. And then you were thinking on the big picture, historically, what had already happened in history and what was going on in other countries. Was one factor more powerful than the other, or were they working in conjunction?
I think it was just a big, I should say another factor too was in, I really got, I think I mainly got really curious about doing more about this in 2019 and 2020, like especially with the COVID and the George Floyd things and the election denial, like all these things, especially in Portland. Like I started understanding more about what was bothering the right, with all of the more extreme things that happen on the left, especially in Portland. I started seeing how it's very easy for two groups to filter for why the other side is horrible and bad and dangerous if you're focusing on the worst behaviors in that group, right? So it doesn't take much in a very large, complex world with many people. It doesn't take much to filter for the most dangerous and strange people on the other side to build your narrative of why the other side represents a threat. So 2020, especially in Portland, made me more aware of that, of how what was bothering the right, and the dangers that they saw, and it made me more empathetic. But to your question, yeah, I think mainly for me, because in some way, if I get interested in something, I start going down the rabbit hole of how it works, and especially like the psychological elements. I think for me, it was just I got curious about reading more about this problem we were having, and then started checking out how this was a fundamental human problem and how it showed up in so many ways. Yeah.
Okay, so a lot of things worked in your favor to drive you deeper and deeper into this because you've gone pretty deep over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is like, as you mentioned at the beginning, I'm a tech writer and always been
Yeah.
interested in communicating and research. So that was a part of it too, where I thought I didn't think I was like, I don't think I'm any genius on this stuff. It's more like I think I can just be one of the many people bringing attention to these ideas, and that's kind of my contribution. Is like we just need to be talking about it more. So if I can be one of those people talking about it and making people think about it more, then I'm doing something, even if I'm just part of the whole team effort or something. Yeah.
So a lot of factors drive polarization. On the liberal side, what do you think are the top factors or drivers, I should say? And on the conservative side, what are the top drivers?
Well, I think I mean, it's a tough question on one hand because, it depends on if we're parsing it by like the beliefs themselves or more of like the animosity towards each other. Because I think fundamentally, I do think the fundamental problem that we're faced with is just too much overstated contempt for each other, which then leads to justifications for more aggressive approaches towards each other because we have to defeat the bad guys and be very aggressive and increasingly no compromise in how we do that. So to me, I think the fundamental driver is contempt and fear, overstated senses of contempt and fear and threat. And that's not to say there can't be real things that we're concerned about that are defensible things that we're concerned about. It's just to say we often view the other side as a group as representing a much bigger and more extreme threat than they actually pose to us. But yeah, I can go into more detail about like the asymmetries I see between the left and the right if you want me to.
What do you
Yeah.
mean by that asymmetry?
Yeah, I think this was something that the more I've thought about this problem the last few years, especially, uh, the more important it seemed to me that there are major differences between two groups in conflict, right? I think we tend to think of like a conflict as being sort of like a chessboard, like these pieces have the same ways of moving or the same rules, right? And same basic ways of trying to achieve their goals and such. But I think it's really important to see that groups can have very big differences. Like so, for example, liberal people pretty much dominate major cultural institutions like education, media, news media, entertainment media, and so that's a big asymmetry in the sense that if you're a conservative, you see yourself as a big underdog. You see yourself as fighting these powerful cultural institutions that are aligned against you and it may feel like they're contemptuous and insulting and threatening to you. So that might just that might explain why you might be more okay with somebody who's a bit rough and tumble like Trump because you're okay as you feel like the underdog. You're okay with somebody who's pushing back in more aggressive ways. Um,
Like
just to,
fighting the establishment kind of
yeah,
thing.
fighting the establishment, which is sort of a populist, thing in general. And you kind of saw that, there's a bit of that in Bernie Sanders too, where it's like, hey, let's be a little bit, let's call these people out more, this stuff that we don't like. So just to say, there's various asymmetries, I would say, and I think the nature of conflict is we'll reach for the things that the other side does that are bad that our group doesn't do as a way to say, look, they're clearly worse than us because they do XYZ things and our group, our side or whatever doesn't do those things. So in the sense of, conservatives might be like, hey, there's no conservative college students like shouting people down and chasing them around the campus, right? And that's a way to say, hey, it's all liberals' fault. But liberals will be like, hey, there's no liberal version of Donald Trump who speaks in these really, contemptuous ways and talks about enemies and blah blah blah. So it's just to say we reach for the ways that the groups are different as ways to say our group doesn't need to do anything, we don't need to do anything about this. But I think seeing the complexity of the conflict is hugely important because when you see how groups can behave and in different ways and have different ways of moving and different ways of reacting to things and different ways of justifying things, it helps you see the complexity of the conflict. And you can see, going back decades in this country, like there's been increasing contempt on both sides, which is manifested in very different ways, right? It manifests in different ways depending on the sides because there's also educational differences, there's cultural differences in how it manifests. But so the conflict is complex. And I think when you see that complexity, it gives you more motivation to be a part of changing it, even if you think the quote other side is worse or more toxic or whatever.
Right. So if one asymmetry on the liberal side is that there's a sort of liberal elite that is in control of entertainment, the media, education, academia, psychology, like the culture, right? The higher culture is a liberal culture, so that's asymmetrical. And as a conservative, you might feel unrepresented there, unnoticed, unseen.
Mhm.
What is an asymmetry on the conservative side?
Well, I think it's, there's various, I would say there's various ones there, but I would say it's, they're more working class, blue collar, these kinds of things. It's a little reverse from that specific one. There's a book called Asymmetric Politics. Their premise, which I think is was pretty persuasive, was that Republicans in general were more ideological than Democrats. Like Republicans, and they gave the example, if you go to the Republican website, it was about specific ideas of what they were trying to accomplish.
Like a
Whereas if you went to the
philosophy, like a
yeah, philosophy, like smaller, say like smaller government, whatever it may be, specific ideas. And then if you went to the Democratic Party website, it was mostly about here's how we're serving the various coalitions in our group. So it was
Mm.
more like it was seeing a difference in terms of how these parties behaved. Like one group was trying to achieve, there's obviously overlaps and other things where they can do things differently, but by and large, they were making the point that Republicans were more ideological and Democrats were more trying to win the approval of various factions in their demographic, which might shift in various ways, which would explain why they're might embrace something new suddenly for a different demographic. I think that was maybe more accurate a few years ago, but I think by and large it still mostly stands. But they were making the point it helps explain why both groups can see each other in more pessimistic ways, because if Republicans view themselves as more ideological, they'll also view Democrats as motivated more by ideology than they are. They'll foresee Democrats as trying to enact some grand ideology, whereas Democrats are just trying to get votes based on winning approval from their various
Um,
demographics. By and large, they're talking trends here. And then Democrats also can perceive Republicans as cold by them being more ideological. They view them as heartless, or these kinds of things. So it was just interesting examinations of different ways of moving and behaving. Yeah.
that's interesting. That's I hadn't thought about projecting oneself onto the other in a political context, but that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, that
Um,
was a good. I actually have an interview with one of the authors of that, but I interviewed him months ago and still haven't put it out. So, but I should get that out one of these days.
um, but I do want to dial in specifically on this emotion of contempt, and that is the primary theme of your most recent book, How Contempt Destroys Democracy. And you say that having contempt for individual people is not the problem, but I quote, the problem arises when we allow our animosity and contempt for specific people on the other side to alter our perception of the entire group. So, what do you mean by that? And why does that spiral into something terrible?
Yeah, and I should say, contempt. I don't think contempt is ever good, but I do think what I was trying to get at there is that I'm not naive. We're all going to be contemptuous of various people. For example, I'm a bit contemptuous of Trump, but I still understand why people voted for him, and I do have cognitive empathy for him. Like I understand a lot about I think he's trying to help the country in many ways. I just don't like how he engages with people. So it was my way of saying, because I think sometimes the objection to this work is like, you need to remove your judgment and your contempt, your anger to be a part of this work or to be behind this cause. So I'm trying to give people an out to feel like, hey, you can still be angry at specific people, but I think you have to try to understand what's driving, by and large, the half the country to support one group or the other, and see try to understand the defensible and understandable concerns they have and what's leading to their behaviors and their concerns, their fears, their anxieties. And even I would say, and I don't think contempt is a good thing. So I don't think I really have contempt for Trump. I judge him in various ways, just like I judge a lot of people, but that's what we do as humans, like people who we get I also think it's important to understand we're all humans. We judge all the time. Like people that would get angry at me for being angry at Trump. I mean, they're also presumably angry at various other people, right? Like so we all have people we're angry about. So I'm trying to give people the show them that it's mostly about how we amplify conflict with our contempt for the entire other side. And there's all sorts of ways that this plays out. You know, the ways we speak about Democrats hate America, or Republicans are trying to destroy democracy. Republicans are fascists or whatever. These kind of group aimed insults, and there's various indirect forms of that too. Because I think even criticisms of specific people can have group amplifying polarization aspects. Like if you say Trump only wants to do X because he's greedy and horrible, that can kind of translate and be heard by people as saying, oh, somebody who has that stance or that wants that policy is only motivated by greed or being horrible, right? So there's various ways that this kind of group
Yeah.
contempt can be expressed, and that just ramps up both sides' views that the other side wants to destroy them and hates them and such.
Right. You're talking about separating actions and behavior from motives, which is a very key distinction that we make in Braver Angels is that, we have observable actions, sayings and behaviors, but then we're always interpreting what they mean. And our interpretation becomes reality. But in fact, we don't know what the real motives are because we
Right.
don't know these people. But it sounds like when we have so much contempt for the whole group, when we extend that contempt for the individual to the whole group, then we make these overriding judgments about their motives and
Mhm.
what they're out to do when we don't really know.
Yeah, the mind reading is big, because contempt leads to mind reading where we're like, oh, I know Elon Musk is only doing this because he's greedy and hates something or wants to have power or whatever it may be. And Elon Musk is doing the same thing where he's like, I know the Democrats are only doing this on immigration because they want power. And it's like, so everybody's mind reading and assuming the worst about the other side, which
Right.
understandably creates a sense of threat when you think that's what they think of me. Like that is not right. I know it's not right. So therefore they are very dangerous and they want to destroy us, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's trying to separate and trying to be humble. I mean, I think that's the hard part, is like so many people we're drawn to more certain, when our emotions are involved, we're drawn to more certain framings, and that leads to the mind reading and everything. But
The
it's like
certainty trap.
yeah, the
Yeah.
certainty trap. Yeah, to quote Alana Redstone, which I almost named my book the Contempt Trap. So
You also say that having contempt for others becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You write, contempt and fear help create the very behaviors that upset us. We provoke in others the very things we say we hate. Um, can you give an explicit example of how this has played out?
yeah, and I think people. I'll preface it by saying I think a really good book, if people want to dig into this more, is the Anatomy of Peace, which is just a really good an examination of conflict dynamics, and that was the book that got me thinking about this. Uh, but I would say I could probably think of better examples for this, but I think a lot of times for these various divides and stances on either side, we tend to think, oh, the other side is just doing what they do and we're fighting against them. They're behaving in a crazy way on their own and we're fighting against them. But the more we can see that these things can be really tied together. So the example I was talking about recently was, let's say like anti-racism kinds of views on the left. There's some really pessimistic views that can be present where, and we saw a big rise of that in 2020, or even before that when Trump got elected. A lot of views filtering for worst case interpretations of, this XYZ represents racism of either intentional personal racism or systemic racism, or different kinds of racism. So there's a lot of people filtering for where the racism is, and I think that was accentuated by Trump's personality, in the sense that whether you think he's racist or not, he behaves in a very aggressive way that can easily be perceived as evidence of animosity and racism. And not to say that, I'm trying to avoid blame here, but I think the way that these things work is So Trump gets elected. It helps his way of behaving makes people think, oh, they reach for white supremacy narratives, explaining like because of the very pessimistic views of Trump and Trump voters, which a very good paper on overly pessimistic views of racism on the conservative side. A very good paper on that is Musa Al-Garbi's Race and the Race for the White House, which examined very over pessimistic views, finding racism on the conservative side amongst Trump voters and such. But Trump's aggressive and kind of us versus them way of behaving often made it easier to filter for those kinds of perceptions because it just fit into this slot. It made it easier for people to see signs of contempt or animosity wherever
Right.
Trump was involved, and then that created more pessimistic narratives on the left about Trump voters and Trump, and then that animosity when that goes too far on the left and it finds people on the left are behaving in unreasonable ways or ways that are easy to criticize as overly pessimistic, like the XYZ is a sign of racism, and other people are like, no, that's just a normal thing, or that's not a clear sign of racism. So just to say, both sides can behave in ways that drive the other side's vision of worst case scenarios of that side when both groups behave in those ways. So when the left is speaking in overly pessimistic ways about racism on the right, that feeds into the right's view that, oh, the left has lost their mind, they're obsessed with race, they're seeing
Right.
finding racism everywhere now, and then that makes the right more angry, and they're like, we got to be more aggressive with these people, which feeds into the left's perception of like, look, they are racist, look how aggressively they're fighting our stances on this anti-racism stuff, like. So
Right.
but that's just one example. I think this happens for many things, and I think the Anatomy of Peace book has a really good explanation for people that want to dig into it more, because it gives one of the main stories is like a Palestinian and an Israel person, and they talk about that
Yeah.
conflict, and they also talk about interpersonal conflict. I mean, these things are the same in interpersonal conflicts too. We can kind of bring out in our partner, if we have a bad relationship with our partner, people might be able to relate to this. We can bring out exactly the same behaviors in them that we most dislike someone.
Like when I nag my husband, do this, why don't you do this? Or this should have been done already. And then,
Yeah, yeah,
and he might double down and just not do it because I'm pushing so hard. So
right.
fine, I'm not going to do it.
Well,
And
and both sides know both sides know what triggers the other side, right? So people, it explains a lot about how we behave online, where people are always trolling each other on both sides, where they're saying precisely the things that they know will bother them, right? And it's
yeah,
at some level, there's a bit of this in a lot of people, including mature political leaders and pundits, where they are purposely putting the knife in there a little bit when they can, because they know what bothers their opponents, right? And so
yes.
that's confirmation to the other side that, like, look, they really do hate us because look at the way they're twisting the knife in every chance they get, right?
Right, right. But I see what you're saying with the racism and white supremacy stance, because I know a lot of people, and I have felt this way that myself, that maybe I resist some of that, not because I'm such a supremacist, but I'm feeling left out, or I'm feeling like I'm not being included, or that my background doesn't count. My family doesn't count. My values don't mean anything. They're not worth it. I'm so privileged, right? And it's an assumption. And I have encountered that assumption that I'm white, so therefore I must have all this money, I must have all this education, I must have all these resources. But, we were pretty dirt poor growing up. And white poverty doesn't count for anything in this kind of extreme form of that narrative. And then that makes me more defensive and
Right, and then
double
that's
down. And
confirmation, in
yeah,
the worst case playing out of this, and it's like, oh, they're defensive. That means we're onto something. And
yes,
that's kind of a thing you see a lot too, which is interesting to me. They're like, if they're bothered, that means you're over the target. You see that kind of thinking too, where it's like,
yeah,
that's a sign that you're right. I'm like, no, it's not a
yeah.
sign you're right. It just means you're bothering someone.
You make a powerful distinction between understanding someone versus agreeing with them. So, understanding others does not mean agreeing with or supporting or condoning their viewpoints. Can you unpack that a little bit more and give us an example of you doing that yourself?
Yeah, I think well, I think the important thing to realize there is, I mean, it's such a common objection that I've heard doing this work, and I've seen other people doing this work get this objection where you try to explain like, well, here's what people are thinking, and but they interpret it as, oh, you're defending that view, you agree with that view, right? It's like, no, those are two separate things. Like you can be completely empathetic to a total enemy, right? Like you could be in the Civil War fighting on the North or South, but completely understand why they're fighting against you and see the humanity of that person on the other side. Like understanding it does not equate with agreeing, right? Like you can disagree very strongly. So I think that's the such a core objection, though, which I think is a fundamental aspect of why conflict is so hard to resolve. Because people think that even internally, they think that trying to understand the other side is somehow giving the other side points and it's weakening one's own point, even in your own mind, where it's like, I don't want to think about what they're thinking because that's going to weaken my own strength in my own mind or something, right? So it's like
My
there's
own righteous, I'm
yeah,
right.
my
I'm right.
righteousness, it's
Yeah.
gonna, it's gonna weaken my resolve against them, and I know that they need to be defeated. So I think there's just various factors that lead us to not want to examine other people's points of view when we're in conflict. But yeah, for me, I would say support of Trump is a good example. I mean, I started out, very angry and judgmental, and slowly came to understand what was driving all these things, and that what was driving the frustrations, the concerns, the anger at the left, and that was a long process. I mean, even recently, I've been working on this, increasing my understanding of that by talking to Trump voters, asking them like, well, how do you view our toxic divides? Specifically, Trump voters who want to, say they want to reduce toxic divides. That makes me curious, you know, well, how do you view our toxic divides, and how is that different from how I view it? And obviously, it involves them seeing so much toxicity on the left, and that's what they are filtering for, right? Whereas people on the left are filtering for Trump's toxicity or Trump's friends' toxicity. So it's just a matter of how we're filtering and what priorities we're putting on things. And the longer I've gone on, the more understanding I have of the various, angles of how people can approach this, large complex world where you can easily reach so many different views about so many different things. That's what's so mind-boggling, I think, about this existence is like we can so easily reach such different points of view about so many things.
Yeah, based on our experiences, our differing life experiences. But you mentioned empathy here. Having understanding involves having empathy, which doesn't mean that you support or agree with their views necessarily. And you mentioned empathy earlier too, when you talked about Trump and how you don't like his style and the aggression and the manner and the way things are done, but you've made that separation with him where you think, well, he thinks he's doing a good thing. Like
Yeah.
he thinks he's in the right and that he's serving the country, and I'll leave it at that.
And I do try to separate beliefs and stances from like how we engage, because that it helps explain why, somebody could completely agree with Trump's stances, but really dislike him for the way he engages, right? So that's what I think it's very important
Yeah.
to make that separation because it helps us understand where people are prioritizing which thing, right? And I think that's a very important distinction for overcoming conflict. Because I mean, I agree with Trump on some things and I disagree with him on other things, but the main thing to me is the how we engage part. But I have a whole episode about having cognitive empathy for Trump and for Trump voters and getting into like, hey, the press played a role in amplifying Trump's anger, and some of his anger was justified. And you can see that even if you very much hate Trump, you can see how there was kind of a give and take. Speaking about how we bring out the worst behaviors in others, there was very bad, irresponsible coverage of Trump, and that is a real thing. And if you want to understand how the conflict progresses, you have to understand those dynamics and be curious about them. Yeah.
Last question for you. What can ordinary people like you and me do to reduce polarization in ourselves and others? What are some concrete actions or behaviors? And you've already alluded to several of these, but just in your mind, what rises to the top?
Yeah, well, I mean, I kind of separate things into like easiest and then a little harder and then the hardest. And I think the easiest one we can all do in our daily lives is just taking a moment before we respond to things, especially online, because I think how this self-amplifying conflict cycle works is, we're all agitated and we're always sharing resources that agitate people more, and some of those are insulting the other side and worst case framings or bad coverage of something. And so I think thinking more about what are we actually doing when we're online and sharing these things. A lot of times we're just venting, and a lot of that venting is just not really accomplishing anything, because what influence do most of us have? If you're following the news, you're following the news. If you're not, you're not. If you know where you stand on Trump, what are all these things we're doing, sharing online and spending our time? I think we just need to be more cognizant of what am I actually doing with my time. As Ezra Klein ended his book, Why We're Polarized, he talked about, we focus way too much on things we can't change, which is part of the polarization problem. We're just getting angry about things we can't change. So if you're angry and you don't actually feel like you're doing anything much constructive, reading the news and doom scrolling or posting online, thinking about how you can help your community and doing something that you think is good in your community. But it's all a matter of what you think you're accomplishing. And I think just thinking more about that is important. And then second, I'd say, I think the slightly harder thing is pushing back on overly pessimistic and overly insulting, unreasonable things that you find, especially on your own side, amongst your allies, because it's much harder to do, obviously. But for people willing to do it, you could draw attention to those things when people are doing it and say, hey, do you think what you're doing is contributing to like a self-reinforcing cycle of toxic conflict? Do you think this could be how we got to where we are, no matter what your views and concerns are? And I've seen a lot of success with that, drawing attention, getting people to think about, well, how did we get here? Like no matter what your views or concerns and anxieties are now, we should be thinking about how we got here so we can think about how to get out of it. So yeah, pushing back a little bit on things you think are unreasonable, especially amongst your allies, because they're the only ones likely to listen to you. Those are two big things. And then just sharing, I think sharing these kinds of ideas with other people and helping overcome the natural objections people have
Yeah.
to this kind of work is another thing people can easily do. It's like, hey, I read or heard something interesting about this topic that what do you all think of it? Just kind of sharing things that way, because that's how we start more conversations amongst people, including even amongst politically passionate people who have major concerns. I do think a lot of people feel like this work is opposed to their political passion or their activism, but I think we need to help people see that you can approach your politics and your goals while you're thinking about how to reduce the toxicity of the conflict.
So I think I heard four things to summarize, make sure I heard you correctly. So pausing, right, when we get riled up and agitated before we respond to anything or any person, just pause and wait. And when we calm down, we can usually be more constructive, in our behavior. You also talked about looking at what's in our control. And if something's not in our control, maybe we shouldn't be spending so much time getting agitated about it if it's not in our control. And taking stock of our own side. What is a little unreasonable about my side? And what is overly negative or overly pessimistic, overly critical? Just kind of like taking stock and maybe criticizing my own side, and then sharing ideas about how to be better at this as a society and as individuals, right? Like we talk about citizenry in Braver Angels. What does it mean to be a good citizen and a responsible citizen? And I think you're getting to that same point.
Yeah, introspection. Yeah, Robert
Yeah.
Tadlice's recent book was what was it? Civic Solitude or something like that. But yeah, the importance of introspection and thinking things through a little bit if you want to be a good citizen. Yeah, good summary.
All right, we've reached the end of our conversation. Thanks so much again, Zach, for being here, making the time out of your busy schedule to be here with us. I'm really looking forward to having you as a special guest at some upcoming events in the Portland metro area. So thanks for that too.
Well, thank you, Dimitri. It's an honor to be asked, and I appreciate you reaching out.
And thanks again to everyone listening. If you'd like more information about Braver Angels, please go to our website, braverangels.org. To find out about local events, go to braverangels.org/Oregon.
I do not feel separated.
Music for this episode is Hello, I Love You, written by Ben Karen and Leo Gallo, and performed by Ben Karen, Fadine Keelty, Ray Cole, Nathan Heldman, Oscar Bugarin, and Mary Keating. Watch this and other songs by Ben Karen on youtube.com/Ben Karen Creates. That's BenCaroncreates. Thanks to Ben and team for allowing us to use this song.
Oh, yeah, I love you. Oh, hayo namaste. You know I love you.